All right. Now, the issue with the tipping point is, and this is the way it's been explained to me by some different producers and some different executives, is that when you're looking at the economics of a film, you have to look at what point is there a situation where it makes more sense to keep the production in California, even though California costs more. Now, is this tipping, and when we have this tipping point, does this mean that it costs 10% more to stay in California, 20% more, 30% more, 40% more? We know that 40% more is probably, well, it really is too much. But maybe it's at 20% more. You spend 20% more to stay here in California, but the trade-off is that you don't have to pay for moving people, you don't have to pay all the extra per diems, you don't have to pay for housing, you don't have to pay for logistics, you don't have to worry about losing days to factors that you don't want to have to deal with. Bad weather obviously is a good example, unless you're filming indoors, but still you have logistics concerns, various other troubles that can come up, moving people back and forth, having to, if you're the producer or the executive, it means that you have to spend your time on site. So for a number of producers who obviously live here, it means that if they have more than one production, they can do them both while staying in the same place. If they've got one production, it means that they can still coordinate the financing, they can coordinate what they need to back here and not have to spend a lot of their time traveling. And from an efficiency standpoint, it is a big deal. And what is the trade-off point? And depending on the studio you talk to, depending on the producer you talk to, it seems to be at differing levels. But one thing is clear, that the incentive that the state of California actually put in was good enough, even as it stood, to completely fill up with the first time it was offered within a week or 2 weeks. I mean, just, everybody made the applications, everybody jumped on it and said, we want to do this. California right now has a $100 million ceiling per year on the amount of credits they offer. And that filled up almost immediately when it came up this past year. And because they front-loaded, it was actually $200 million the first year, it's $100 million each year after that. So it's actually going to run out in 2013, not 2014. But you compare that with New York, which I think has about a $500 million ceiling, and New York still fills up. It says that there's a huge amount of room in California for these incentives, for people, for the demand, for people who would actually like to stay here. For them, that tipping point could be at a 15% credit. It could be something that's not nearly as big as you run into in Louisiana, in Michigan, obviously, its peak, even in the UK, where it's running at 25% for UK co-productions and such. That means that California doesn't have to race to the bottom. It doesn't have to keep upping its incentives to match the best, most aggressive incentives that Louisiana is offering, and one of the other states is offering. What it needs to do is just make it affordable enough. And you can ask, okay, well, why should California have to do this? Why should California have to compete? We never did in the past. Well, the honest answer is that California didn't have to compete against other states in the same way. Ever since 2002, 2003, 2005, that competition with other states, not just other countries, has been dramatically higher. And it's a big deal. These other states have realized they can lure these mobile productions in a way they never used to. And if you watch over the next year or two, some of these states are going to roll back their incentives. Some of them will roll them back dramatically. But the concern isn't the places that get the occasional production or get a rash of them for a couple years. It's the states that get them for years and years and years. If North Carolina develops a good enough TV studio that the CW can keep filming stuff out there, that's a threat. If Louisiana develops good enough facilities that you can have a movie called Battlefield LA be filmed in Shreveport.
Los Angeles.
Los Angeles, whatever the current name is, Battle Los Angeles, whatever the current name is.
He worked on it.
Yeah. Well, that says something right there. So my apologies to the producers, but yes.
It's okay, I interviewed Neil Moritz.
Yeah.
He told me why he went there.
Yeah.
Sony said, I'll give you $10 to make this movie, not 20.
Yeah.
and go make it where you want.
And quite honestly, there are a few other factors that are basically going on here. People forget that when the studios were first set up, the studio system was first set up, most of their financial backers were still back in New York. A lot, that Lowe's Corporation, which owned MGM, was back in New York, and that they had to report back, and that it was a big deal that you set up these studios and you kept things self-contained and you had to keep a cap on costs, and that the economies of scale worked well at that time. But nowadays, you're dealing with studios where, with the exception of Disney, corporate headquarters aren't in LA. They're somewhere else. Whether it's in New York, whether it's in Philadelphia, whether it's back in Tokyo, wherever it is, they're not necessarily here. The studios themselves are headquartered here, but the parent companies aren't. And that means that they've got pressure coming down on their bottom lines. DVD sales have declined, and that's an issue because it's not that DVD sales flattening out is necessarily unexpected. It really should be. It's hit a saturation point. What it does mean, though, is that the margins the studios have to play with aren't as strong. And if we've been in a recession and electronic sales have been down and various other product sales have been down and heavy industry sales have been down, that pressure is there. And so a lot of these studios have to say, all right, what can I justify for this budget? What budget do we have to work with? How many films am I making at a certain price point? And it's that range that is a big deal. And if they know they can save 15-20% on it, then it's very much worth for them doing that. And Sony has been very, very open about the fact that they are trying to make the best deal that they can. They want to make really good movies, obviously, and if given the choice, sure, they'd make them here, but the price point hasn't been favorable to them. Look at Fox. Fox films almost nothing in LA anymore, and haven't for a number of years. They built a whole studio out in Australia, just simply because of the fact that they knew that from the Australia incentive standpoint, that it was a good deal to keep filming down there. I mean, that's.
Doesn't that have something to do with Rupert Murdoch?
Well, Rupert Murdoch, the advantage is that he had the connections to make it happen, but it's an English language place with good weather. The fact that the things filmed there might have been filmed in the UK instead. We're basically dealing with films that went somewhere outside of LA. They were going to go somewhere else. It just happens to be that Rupert Murdoch had the connections to put in Australia. They could have been in Canada. They could have been in Britain. I mean, when you're dealing with the Star Wars prequels that were all largely filmed in the UK in the first place, and they went to Australia for the second round, that tells you that those kinds of films were going somewhere else anyway. And there's a history of films being filmed overseas going back to the 70s, that these big tentpole movies. And that hasn't really changed. It's the issue that we're running into is that it's these mid-level films that you worry about. It's the fact that the smaller films, these movies of the week, don't get filmed in California at all anymore. And as I said, you can't win the race to the bottom. A bunch of these are gone and they're not coming back. The issue is protecting that middle ground and making it for even with the big blockbusters, which aren't even currently covered by the incentives as they stand, that they have a reason to film here more than just convenience, that things can be structured effectively, that they can pay a little bit more and know they're getting value for what they're paying for.
What effect do you think piracy has on all this runaway production and the studio's bottom line?
Piracy is something that essentially has been showing up since the videotape. And it's been showing up even more with digital format and DVDs. And it's always going to be a threat and always has been. I think that in the end, the real concern is the digital download. That is, people find it more acceptable to download things digitally and watch them digitally. Yeah, it's an absolute issue. I think that in the end, the fundamental issue really is the maturing of the DVD market, piracy or not. That's more important. I think that piracy absolutely is and should be a concern, but in terms of the overall effect on the marginal economics, and I'm sure others would disagree with me, I don't think it's the primary issue. I don't even think it's necessarily the secondary issue. I think the number one issue is DVD sales matured, so profits got tighter. And number two, cost of doing everything in California consistently went up. Housing prices went up, land prices went up, cost of living has gone up dramatically. In many ways, the housing bubble bursting may be a very good thing for the economics of staying here because it's flattened all these costs that were soaring dramatically. The downside is that it also puts a lot of pressure on people who bought their houses here and now have to deal with the fact that their mortgages are bigger than their house value is.